Tonight, we follow a different kind of footballer, not one remembered for speed or for goals, or for the kind of noise that fills a stadium and lingers for days afterward. We follow a player who seemed to slow everything around him down, one who understood where the game was going before it had decided for itself. Juan Sebastián Verón was that kind of player, not always celebrated, not always understood, but consistently, quietly, unmistakably present at the center of things. He did not need to run the game into submission. He simply knew it. He read it the way you might read a room, without appearing to try, without announcing his conclusions, just moving accordingly, placing a pass where it needed to land before the geometry had fully resolved. He spent years at the summit of European football, and 1 year at a club where that summit felt unreachable. He came home. He won the Copa Libertadores at the age of 34. And when he finally retired, it was at an age when most footballers had long since moved on to other things. This is his story. It begins in La Plata. La Plata is a planned city. It was designed from scratch in 1882, laid out in a perfect geometric grid with diagonal avenues cutting across it at regular intervals, as though the architects believed that order could be imposed from the beginning. There is something fitting about a city like that, producing a footballer who thought in structure, in angles, in the lines that exist between things. Juan Sebastián Verón was born there on the 9th of March, 1975. He grew up in a city that understood football the way most Argentine cities do, not as entertainment, but as identity, not as something you watch, but as something you are. His father, Juan Ramón Verón, was a professional footballer, not a peripheral one. He had played for Estudiantes de La Plata, one of Argentina's most storied clubs, and had won the Copa Libertadores with them in 1968 as part of a side that was famous for its tactical discipline and its refusal to yield ground cheaply. He was known as La Bruja, the witch, a nickname that suggested something almost supernatural in his movement and his understanding of the game. That name would pass to his son. Not immediately, not officially, but eventually, naturally, the way certain things are inherited without anyone choosing them. Growing up with a father who had played at the highest level of South American football means something specific. It means that the language of the game enters the household early. It means that conversations about positioning, about pressing, about when to hold the ball and when to release it, happen at the dinner table. It means that a child learns to read the game as vocabulary before they learn it as instinct. Juan Sebastián absorbed that environment. He did not have to find football. Football was already there, already structured around him, already something his family understood in depth. Juan Ramon's influence was not simply that of a proud father who had once played the game. He was a man who thought about football deeply and who communicated that depth naturally. He had played in an era when South American football was tactically rich and physically unforgiving, and he had survived and flourished in that environment by being smarter than those around him, rather than faster or stronger. That is a specific kind of lesson to grow up watching. It tells a young person that the mind is the primary instrument, that the body is the means by which thought is expressed on a pitch. Juan Sebastián learned this not through instruction, but through proximity to someone who embodied it. There were afternoons at the Estudiante ground, the Estadio Jorge Luis Hirschi, watching training sessions, watching how senior players moved and communicated with each other, how coaches delivered information, how the structure of a practice session translated into the structure of a game. For a child with a natural inclination to observe and understand, these were formative hours. The stadium itself, modest in scale, but embedded deeply in the city's identity. was a place that felt familiar in the way that childhood places do when they are connected to something important. It was not grand. It was honest. The Veron name carried weight in that place. People connected it to something specific, not celebrity in a broad sense, but respect within a particular community that took football seriously and remembered the 1968 Copa Libertadores as a shared point of pride. Oh, growing up as the son of a figure that community remembered well was not always uncomplicated. There was expectation in that name before Juan Sebastián had done anything to earn it himself. He would have understood, even as a young person, that he was not building a reputation from nothing. He was building it alongside an existing one, and the proximity of that existing reputation required him to be clear about what he was doing and why. He joined Estudiantes as a young player. This was the obvious choice in terms of geography and family connection, but it was also a club that suited the way he was beginning to understand the game. Estudiantes had a culture built around collective intelligence. They were not a club that celebrated individual extravagance for its own sake. They valued players who thought, who organized, who understood their role within a larger structure. For a midfielder who was already demonstrating a capacity for seeing the whole pitch, this was an environment that made sense. His development through the youth ranks was gradual. He was not a player who burst onto the scene in spectacular fashion. He was a player who grew into his qualities, who refined the things that would eventually define him. He was tall for a central midfielder, physically substantial in a way that would later serve him well in the physical demands of Serie A. He had 2 strong feet. He could strike the ball with power and with placement. But the most distinguishing thing, even as a young player, was his awareness, his positioning, his ability to be in the right place before the play had arrived there. These are not qualities that show up in highlights. They show up in the shape of a game, in the way a team moves when someone understands the spaces they should be occupying. His senior debut with Estudiantes came in the early 1990s. He was a teenager stepping into professional Argentine football, a league that is demanding and physical, and that rewards competitive intelligence from an early age. He was not yet the complete player he would become. He was still developing his stamina, his weight distribution, his ability to sustain his level across 90 minutes in senior football. But the fundamental qualities were already visible. The range of passing, the composure under pressure, the understanding that the game is not just about what you do with the ball, but about what you do to create the conditions in which the ball arrives well. Argentine football in the early 1990s was a complicated environment for a young playmaker. The league was physically demanding and tactically uneven. There were games where technical quality was rewarded and games where it was simply overwhelmed. Veron learned to play through both kinds of environments. He learned to protect the ball when protection was needed and to release it quickly when space was available. These lessons in adaptability would serve him across every league he subsequently played in, even if the application of those lessons looked different depending on where he was. His time at Estudiante in those early professional years established him as a player worth watching. The club was not one of Argentina's wealthiest. They did not dominate the Superliga the way River Plate and Boca Juniors did. But they were consistently organized, consistently competitive, and they developed players with a seriousness that was recognized across the country. Veron benefited from that seriousness. He was coached by people who valued the things he was good at, and he had teammates who understood how to use a distributor effectively. The move to Boca Juniors came as a natural step upward in Argentine football terms. Boca is one of the 2 biggest clubs in the country, based in Buenos Aires, carrying the weight of an enormous supporter base and a history thick with titles and identity. Moving to Boca was a statement about where a player stood in Argentine football. It meant something had been recognized, Veron arrived there with a growing reputation as a midfielder who could control the tempo of a game, who could hold the ball intelligently and distribute it with quality. At Boca, the tactical demands were higher. The margin for error in big matches was smaller. The scrutiny was more intense. He did not spend a long time at Boca. His stay there was transitional in nature, a step between the familiar environment of Estudiantes and the next significant phase of his career. But it was not insignificant. Playing for a club of Boca's stature in Argentina sharpens a player. The atmosphere of the Bombonera, the noise and the pressure and the expectation, is its own form of education. A midfielder who can control tempo in that environment has demonstrated something about their temperament as well as their technique. Veron demonstrated both. European interest in him was growing. Italian clubs in particular had a long history of looking to South America for midfield quality, and by the mid-1990s, Serie A was arguably the finest league in the world. Its tactical organization was extraordinary. Its physical demands were serious. Its coaches were among the most sophisticated in the game. When the approach came from Sampdoria, it represented an enormous opportunity and an enormous test. Sampdoria were based in Genoa, one of Italy's great port cities, built into hills that dropped steeply toward the sea. The club had a proud history and had reached the European Cup final in 1992, though they had been through a period of transition since those heights. When Veron arrived, they were not at the summit of Italian football, but they were a serious club with serious players and a culture that understood football in depth. For a 21-year-old arriving from South America, the adjustment to Serie A life was substantial. The Italian game in that period was unlike anything in South American football. The tactical structure was rigid in a way that demanded specific intelligence from every player. The spaces were smaller. The pressing was more organized. The rhythm of the game was different, slower in some phases, suddenly explosive in others, with very little margin for casual possession. For a player whose primary quality was his reading of the game, this was actually an environment that could reward him. But first, it had to be understood. The language, the culture, the tactical expectations of Italian football all needed to be absorbed. Veron absorbed them. He was never the type of player who needed everything to be perfect around him before he could function. He was adaptive in the way that genuinely intelligent players tend to be. He watched how Italian midfielders operated. He understood the value placed on defensive positioning as well as offensive contribution. He learned that in Serie A, a central midfielder who gave the ball away cheaply was a liability in a way that a central midfielder in Argentine football was not. The tolerance for error in Italian football was lower. The consequences were more severe. His time at Sampdoria was a period of becoming. He arrived as a young player with significant talent and left as a midfielder who had proven himself capable of functioning at a high level in the most demanding tactical environment in European football at that time. He had not yet reached his ceiling, but he had demonstrated enough to attract attention from clubs that were operating at the very top of Italian football. The city itself contributed something to that period of growth. Genoa is a layered place, ancient, compressed between mountains and sea, with a history built on trade and navigation, and the kind of practical intelligence that comes from finding routes through difficult terrain. Veron was not in Italy to be enchanted by it. He was there to work, to understand a new context, to become better. He trained at the Sampdoria facilities with the same attention he had brought to every environment before. The Italian language came gradually, through necessity and immersion. As it came, So did a more granular understanding of tactical instruction from coaches whose sessions were detailed and precise. He began to follow the conversations in the dressing room, to understand the concerns and adjustments that teammates discussed with each other, to contribute to those conversations in his own developing way. The Italian players around him at Sampdoria were professional in a particular fashion. They separated training from everything else, with a discipline that was total. They were focused, and they did not accommodate players who treated preparation lightly. Veron fit that culture without difficulty. What was new to him was the specific form Italian football's seriousness took. The emphasis on defensive shape, the detailed set-piece preparation, the long post-training sessions in which coaches walked players through video of the previous match and the upcoming opponent. He absorbed it the way someone absorbs a new language through total immersion, not perfectly at first, but with growing fluency and eventual confidence. Parma came next. This was a significant step. Parma, in the late 1990s, were one of the most impressive clubs in Europe. They were not one of Italy's traditional powerhouses in terms of size or history, but they had been assembled with extraordinary care and intelligence under the financial backing of the Parmalat Company. Their squad in that period contained players of genuine world-class quality. Gianfranco Zola had already left by the time Veron arrived, but there were others: Hernan Crespo, Lilian Thuram, Fabio Cannavaro, Dino Baggio. This was a team of genuine quality across every position. Playing alongside those players accelerated Veron's development in specific ways. When the players around you are at a very high level, the demands on your own game increase proportionally. A midfielder, distributing to a striker as good as Crespo, learns quickly what quality of service that striker can use and what will be wasteful. A midfielder, operating next to a defender, as organized as Cannavaro, understands almost immediately what it means to maintain a coherent defensive shape as well as create in possession. The environment at Parma pushed Veron further. He won the UEFA Cup with Parma in 1999. He won the Coppa Italia. He was operating at the level of a genuine Serie A force, contributing to a team that competed seriously for domestic and European honours. His game in that period was becoming more complete. He was always the orchestrator, always the player who decided the tempo and direction of possession, but he was also contributing more directly, arriving into the penalty area at the right moment, striking the ball with power and precision from distance. He was growing into the profile of a complete central midfielder. The UEFA Cup run that season was a genuine achievement. Parma defeated Marseille in the final in Moscow, and their performances across the tournament reflected the quality of the squad Tanzi's money had assembled. Veron's role in that campaign was significant. In matches where Parma needed to manage the game and protect a lead, he was the player who slowed the tempo deliberately, who positioned himself to receive simple passes and then recirculate possession without giving the ball away. In matches where Parma needed to press forward and impose themselves, he was the player who drove the rhythm higher, who played more directly, who arrived at the edge of the box with the ball already moving quickly. The ability to consciously modulate a team's tempo is a skill that sounds simple and is extraordinarily difficult to execute consistently across a full 90 minutes and across a long tournament. Veron could do it at Parma in 1999. Hernan Crespo has spoken in later years about what it was like to play in front of Veron during that period. He described the quality of the passes he received, not just the accuracy, but the timing and the weight. A striker's first touch is largely determined by the pass that precedes it, and Crespo noted that the passes from Veron arrived in such a way that his first touch almost always set him up to do something productive, rather than to simply bring the ball under control. That is an underappreciated form of service. It is one that does not show up in assist statistics with any regularity. Because the pass that creates the goal is invisible in the record but visible to the people who were there. Lazio came calling, and this was the summit of his Italian career. Lazio in that period, under Sven-Göran Eriksson, were genuinely competing to be the best team in Italy and one of the best in Europe. Their squad was assembled with real quality. Pavel Nedved, Alessandro Nesta, Marcelo Salas, Simone Inzaghi, Diego Simeone. These were players of genuine European distinction, assembled into a unit that was tactically coherent and individually formidable. Eriksson was a coach who understood what Veron offered and built a tactical structure around the qualities of his best players. Veron was central to that structure. He was the player through whom Lazio's possession was organized, the player whose positioning in the midfield created the angles and options that allowed Lazio to move the ball with purpose and direction. In a team of significant quality, he was not peripheral. He was foundational. Eriksson was a manager whose training sessions at Lazio were meticulous without being mechanical. He gave his best players the structural clarity they needed to function well and the freedom they needed to express their individual qualities within that structure. For Veron, this was close to an ideal working arrangement. He understood his responsibilities in and out of possession. He understood where the team needed him to be at different moments in a game. Within those understood parameters, he had the license to make decisions, to speed things up or slow them down, to play long or short, to hold or release. Eriksson trusted him with that license because Veron rarely abused it. He did not hold the ball for the sake of it. He did not play the ambitious pass when the simple one was correct. His decision-making was consistently sound. Nedved has described Veron's influence on that Lazio team in terms of what happened in the dressing room before matches. Veron was not a loud pre-match presence. He did not give speeches or deliver tactical instructions to teammates. But he was calm in a way that was contagious. He had a composed quality, at rest, that communicated confidence without arrogance. His teammates read that composure, and it settled them. It is a form of leadership that has no formal title and no obvious expression, but that experienced players recognize and rely on. The 1999 to 2000 season delivered Lazio their second ever Serie A title. It was a championship won in direct competition with Juventus, the club that had dominated Italian football across the decade. Lazio pipped them on the final day of the season. It was a moment of genuine triumph for a club that had been building towards something significant. And Veron was at the center of it. He was playing the best football of his life in that period. The combination of tactical intelligence, physical presence, technical quality, and the experience accumulated across his years in Italy had produced a midfielder who was operating at the very highest level. His range of passing in that period was exceptional. He could play a short, disguised pass into a tight space with the same accuracy as a long, switching ball played across 40 yards of pitch. He understood when to accelerate the tempo of possession and when to slow it, when to draw opponents toward him, and when to release the ball before they arrived. These are not qualities you can teach. They are qualities that develop through experience and intelligence applied over years. There are specific games from that Lazio season that football observers cited at the time as evidence of what Veron was. A match against Juventus at the Stadio delle Alpi, played in the middle of a title race, in which Lazio needed to be organized and disciplined for a full 90 minutes against a side with the quality of Del Piero and Zidane. Veron controlled that match from the midfield in a way that felt almost unhurried. He pressed when pressing was required and retreated when retreating was the correct decision. He turned the ball over once or twice, but recovered his position so quickly and intelligently that the turnovers did not become chances for Juventus. By the end of the game, neutrals who had watched it were describing it as a controlled performance by Lazio. Veron was the reason that control existed. The Champions League brought different challenges. European competition in that period was dense with tactical quality, and Lazio navigated the group stages and knockout rounds with the same organized intelligence that was working so well domestically. Veron's European games confirmed what his Serie A performances suggested, that he was not a player whose quality was produced by a particular stadium or a particular atmosphere, but by a consistent application of understanding that traveled with him wherever he played. European football was watching. English clubs were watching. The Premier League in the early 2000s was in a period of significant financial expansion and was attempting to attract the best players from across Europe. Manchester United, under Sir Alex Ferguson, had established themselves as the dominant force in English football and were consistently competing at the highest level of the Champions League. They had won 3 consecutive Premier League titles and were building a squad of genuine European ambition. The transfer fee that took Veron to Old Trafford in the summer of 2001 was significant, around £28 million, which at the time represented a very large investment for an English club in a midfielder. The expectation that came with that fee was correspondingly large. He arrived at a club that was already populated with players of exceptional quality. Roy Keane in the midfield, Ruud van Nistelrooy in attack, Paul Scholes, Ryan Giggs, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. This was a team that had won the treble in 1999 and was continuing to compete at the summit of European football. The Premier League in 2001 was a different tactical world from Serie A. This is a point that requires some patience to fully understand, because it is easy to look at the surface of a player's adaptation difficulties and conclude that the player was simply not good enough. That conclusion misses the complexity of what was happening. The Premier League at that time placed an extraordinary premium on pace, on transition, on direct vertical play, on physical intensity across 90 minutes in a way that was different in character from the rhythm of Italian football. A midfielder who had thrived on controlling the tempo of play in Serie A was now in an environment where tempo control was less consistently rewarded, where the game moved faster between phases and demanded quicker decisions. Veron had exceptional quality, but the application of that quality in the Premier League required a recalibration that took time and that was not always supported by the tactical framework around him. He had his good games at United. He had periods where his class was unmistakable, where a long diagonal pass or a disguised through ball revealed clearly what kind of player he was. But he also had periods where the pace and directness of the English game seemed to move around him rather than through him, where the structure that had made him so effective in Italy was not consistently recreated. The criticism he received in England was real, and not entirely without basis. But it also misread what was happening. The English football press and public in that period were not always patient with the idea that a player's quality might be expressed differently depending on the tactical environment. The expectation was that a world-class player should be world-class in all environments immediately. That expectation was applied with particular force to players who had arrived for large fees. Ferguson himself, reflecting on Veron's time at the club, acknowledged the complexity of the situation. He acknowledged that Veron was a genuinely gifted player, whose qualities were not always served well by the way the Premier League demanded football be played. This was not a conclusion that was widely reported at the time. At the time, the dominant narrative was simpler. The transfer had not worked. Paul Scholes has reflected on the period when Veron was at United with a degree of candour that was unusual. He said that watching Veron in training which he characterized as exceptional, and watching him in Premier League matches was sometimes a different experience, and that the difference was not about quality, but about context. Scholes recognized, perhaps more clearly than the public commentary did, that United's style of play in that period did not always create the conditions in which Veron's particular intelligence could be fully deployed. Scholes himself operated in a system he had grown up in, a system built around his strength. Veron was operating in a system built around other players' strength, into which he had to insert himself. And the fit was sometimes imperfect. There were individual moments that cut through the noise of that period. A Champions League group stage game against Deportivo de La Coruña in 2001, in which United needed to perform at a high level against a technically accomplished Spanish side. Veron was excellent that evening, in a way that reminded observers exactly why Ferguson had signed him. His distribution was crisp and varied. He covered ground intelligently. He brought a calmness to United's midfield that the Premier League environment did not always afford him. Several journalists who had been critical of his domestic performances acknowledged after that match that something had been visible that they had not seen regularly in the league. The Champions League's slightly more measured tempo, closer in character to Serie A, allowed him to find his rhythm more consistently. What was actually happening was more nuanced. Veron was attempting to apply a set of qualities built across years of Italian football to a league that operated on different principles. He had the quality, he had the intelligence, he had the experience, but the recalibration required was significant, and he was given less time and less structural support to achieve it than a player of his profile ideally needed. He was 30 when he left United for Chelsea, briefly, and then for Inter Milan. Inter Milan was where the recalibration resolved itself. Back in Italian football, in a league that understood what he did and how he did it, Veron found his rhythm again. He was not the same player who had thrived at Lazio 5 years earlier. He was older. His physical peak had passed, but his understanding of the game had not diminished. And in a league that valued that understanding, he was able to contribute with real quality. He played with authority at Inter. He managed the game. He distributed the ball with the same range and precision that had distinguished him years before. He reminded people who had followed his time in England and concluded that the transfer had revealed a limitation, that the game was simply seeing him in the wrong light. Inter Milan in that period were one of the strongest clubs in Italy. Roberto Mancini managed them during part of Veron's time there, and Mancini was a coach who valued technical precision and tactical organization. The squad contained players like Adriano, Martins and Stankovic, a team of genuine quality assembled with real depth. Veron's role was not that of a first-choice starter every week. He was a player who contributed across a season, who provided quality when he played, and who raised the standard in training sessions. In Italian football, that is a valuable contribution. Squads at the top of Serie A require players who can maintain the level across 38 games and across European competition, and the consistency of quality in training determines the readiness of the whole group, not just the starting 11. There were games at San Siro where Veron was given the starting role and used it to remind the Milanese public what the fuss had been about years earlier. His long passing, in particular, attracted renewed attention. The ability to switch the point of attack with a single ball, played diagonally across 60 yards, played with pace and accuracy, and the correct angle to give the receiving player time to control it, is something that looks different from close up than it does on television. Players who were on the pitch for those moments have described the feeling of receiving a Veron pass as distinctive, that the ball arrived in a way that gave them options rather than constraining them, that the weight was always right, that the timing was never early or late, but exactly correct. The return to Estudiantes in 2006 was more than a sentimental homecoming. It was a deliberate choice. He was 31. He could have continued at a high level in European football for perhaps another season or two. Instead, he chose to go back to the club where everything had started, to the city where he had grown up, to the institution that his father had served with distinction. There was something in that choice that reflected the way he understood himself, not as someone who followed the logic of maximum exposure and maximum financial reward, but as someone who was connected to a specific place and a specific football culture. Estudiantes were not a powerhouse in Argentine football terms. They were well-organized, competitive, and serious, but they were operating without the resources of the country's largest clubs. Returning there with the experience Veron brought transformed the environment. His presence in the midfield gave Estudiantes a level of composure and intelligence in possession that smaller Argentine clubs rarely had access to. Younger players around him benefited from watching how he managed games, how he used his body to protect the ball, how he read pressure and adjusted his positioning to avoid it. The Copa Libertadores campaign of 2009 was one of the defining achievements of his career. Estudiantes progressed through the tournament with the kind of collective organization and tactical discipline that the club had always valued. Veron, at 34, was the player who gave that tactical discipline its expression. He was the pivot around whom the team moved. He was not running past defenders anymore. He was never primarily that kind of player, but he was controlling the midfield, making the decisions that kept the team structured, distributing the ball with the accuracy that allowed Estudiantes to play with purpose. The tournament itself, spread across South America against clubs from Brazil, Paraguay, Ecuador, and Mexico, tested Estudiantes in different ways. There were matches that required them to absorb pressure for long periods and defend with the kind of collective organization that Veron's presence encouraged. When the midfield is anchored by a player who reads the game as clearly as he did, the defenders in front of him feel the benefit. They know that the ball will be managed well when it reaches the midfield, that unnecessary risks will not be taken in dangerous areas, that the team will be patient when patience is required, that confidence filters through a defensive unit in ways that are difficult to measure but unmistakable to experience. The two-legged final against Cruzeiro was played across 2 weeks in November and December. Estudiantes drew the first leg in Belo Horizonte and returned to La Plata for the second leg, needing a result in front of their own supporters. The crowd that night understood what was at stake. The stadium held tens of thousands of people who had grown up with Estudiantes as the backdrop of their lives, who knew the 1970 Copa Libertadores as a piece of inherited club history rather than personal memory, and who now had the opportunity to see their team reclaim that height. Veron played the entire match. At 34, he completed the 90 minutes of what was one of the most significant games in the club's recent history. Estudiantes won on the night. The title was theirs. They won the Copa Libertadores in December 2009, defeating Cruzeiro of Brazil over 2 legs. The second leg was played at the Estadio Ciudad de la Plata, in front of a crowd that understood the magnitude of what was happening. Veron was on the pitch for a club that had not won the Copa Libertadores since 1970. He had helped bring them back to the summit of South American club football. The city's connection to this competition, already marked by his father's medal from 1968, was now also marked by his. The Club World Cup followed. Estudiantes represented South America as Copa Libertadores winners and traveled to Abu Dhabi for the tournament. They reached the final, where they faced Barcelona, the best club team in the world at that time, managed by Pep Guardiola, with Lionel Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, and a squad assembled at exceptional depth and quality. Estudiantes were not favoured. They were a provincial Argentine club with limited resources playing against a team that was at the very peak of world football. They took the game to extra time. They held Barcelona at bay for most of the match, with the kind of organized, disciplined defending and careful possession management that Veron understood deeply. Pedro scored for Barcelona in extra time, and that was enough to decide the final. But the run to that final, the manner in which Estudiantes competed against teams from across the world, was a remarkable achievement, and Veron's presence throughout it was central. His international career with Argentina spanned more than a decade and included 3 World Cups. He was part of the Argentina squad for France, 1998. He was part of the team that travelled to South Korea and Japan in 2002. He was called into the squad again for South Africa in 2010, by which point he was 35. These experiences represented different phases of his relationship with the national team, and that relationship was not always uncomplicated. Argentina's expectations of their national team have always been enormous. The country has produced so many players of exceptional quality that the scrutiny applied to every selection and every result is intense. Veron was valued by certain coaches and certain tactical frameworks, and less consistently valued by others. The nature of his contribution, the tempo management, the positional intelligence, the quality of distribution, was not always the first thing crowds or critics focused on. Argentina, at various points, wanted its midfield to be more overtly aggressive, more immediately forceful. Veron's value was sometimes easier to appreciate from a tactical perspective than from the terraces. At France, 1998, Argentina performed respectably before losing to the Netherlands in the quarter-finals. Veron was part of a squad that included Ariel Ortega, Claudio Lopez, Marcelo Gallardo, and was built around the forward quality of Batistuta and Crespo. The midfield in that tournament was competitive, and Veron contributed within a structure that was coherently organized. It was not a tournament that defined him internationally, but it was a first experience of the World Cup, at a time when his European club career was growing significantly. One of the more detailed accounts from the France 1998 squad came from Ariel Ortega, who described Veron in training during that tournament as the player who set the tempo of every session. Not the loudest, not the most athletic, but the one around whom the quality of a training session's possession work was organized. Ortega noted that when Veron was on the pitch during rondos and possession exercises, the ball moved differently, with more purpose, more variety, less predictability. That quality in training translated into preparation that made the team's collective performance sharper. Argentina's second-round game against England in Saint-Étienne, which they won on penalties, was a match in which the midfield's composure under pressure was critical. Veron contributed to that composure. The 2002 World Cup in South Korea and Japan was a tournament of surprising exits and upset results across the board. Argentina were eliminated in the group stage, which was a genuine shock. The expectations had been high. The squad contained players of real quality, but results in South Korea did not go as anticipated, and Argentina went home earlier than almost anyone had imagined. It was a disappointing experience, the kind that leaves marks on the players who lived through it. His return to the national team for South Africa in 2010, under Diego Maradona's management, was in some ways a testament to the durability of his quality. He was included at an age when most of his contemporaries had already retired from international football. Maradona valued his experience, valued the ability to control a game that Veron still possessed. His appearances in that tournament were limited, but his presence in the squad was meaningful. Argentina reached the quarter-finals before losing to Germany in a comprehensive defeat. It was the end of Veron's involvement with the national team. Diego Maradona's decision to bring Veron into the 2010 squad was not universally popular in Argentina. There were younger options available, and the logic of experience versus freshness was debated publicly in the way that Argentine football debates always are, with passion and without much nuance. Maradona was not always concerned with public opinion, and his instinct that Veron's ability to manage a game from the midfield was a resource worth having in a World Cup squad was a defensible one. Argentina's opening group matches in South Africa saw them perform with freedom and force, scoring goals and largely controlling opponents. The squad's cohesion in those early games owed something to the stability that experienced players provided in the dressing room and on the training pitch, even when they were not in the starting 11. Across his international career, he won 57 caps for Argentina. The number is perhaps lower than his quality merited, reflecting the inconsistency with which various coaches used him and the complicated relationship between his particular qualities and the expectations placed on the national team. But within the time he was on the pitch for Argentina, there were moments that reflected exactly what kind of player he was. Moments of composure under pressure, of intelligent decision-making, of passes that unlocked spaces that others had not seen. His later career at Estudiantes continued into the early 2000s. He was aging gracefully in the way that players who are intelligent tend to age, by understanding their limitations clearly and working within them rather than against them. He ran less but saw more. He covered less ground but made better decisions about where to be. The physical qualities that had been elite were diminishing, but the reading of the game that had always been his primary quality was, if anything, sharper. Experience had added layers to the intuition he had always possessed. He officially retired in 2014. He had played professional football for more than 2 decades. He had competed in 4 different countries. He had played in 3 World Cups. He had won league titles in Italy and a continental championship in South America. He had been misunderstood in 1 country and celebrated in 3 others. He had returned to where he started and helped them reach a summit they had not visited in 40 years. The retirement in 2014 did not produce the kind of farewell ceremony that clubs sometimes arrange for long-serving figures. Veron was not a player who sought the spotlight at the end any more than he had sought it during his career. He stepped away from playing and moved into the administrative work of the club with the same quiet purposefulness that had defined everything before it. The transition from player to official was not jarring for those who knew him. He had always thought about football in structural terms, about what a club needed, about how decisions were made, about the long-term health of an institution. That kind of thinking does not stop being useful when the boots come off. The Estudiantes he inherited as an administrator was a club with an identity, but with the practical challenges that mid-sized Argentine clubs consistently face. The financial landscape of Argentine football makes sustained competition with the wealthiest clubs extremely difficult. What a club like Estudiantes can offer that others cannot is continuity, intelligence, and a clearly defined way of working. Veron's presence in the leadership brought credibility to those things. Players and staff at the club understood that they were working under someone who had competed at the highest levels of the game and who had never lost sight of where he came from. Then, in 2017, at the age of 42, he made a brief return to playing. Estudiantes required special dispensation for him to register, given his age. He appeared in a small number of matches, more as a statement of connection than as a genuine return to full-time competition. He was not pretending to be 30. He was demonstrating that the game he had spent his life understanding was something he could still inhabit, even briefly, even at the far edge of what is normally considered possible. The image of him on a pitch at 42, in the shirt of the club, where everything had started, completing passes with the same economy of movement that had always defined him, said something about who he was as a footballer. He had not become a different player over the decades. He had become a more refined version of the same player. The tempo, the positioning, the decision to play a pass before the pressure arrived. These things had not left him. In the years since retiring, he has remained at Estudiantes in a leadership and administrative capacity. He has been involved in the governance of the club, in decisions about its direction, in the process of building for the future. The understanding of football that he carried into every tactical situation across his career has been applied to the challenge of running a club, of thinking about what it means to develop young players, of preserving an institutional culture that values the things the club has always valued. He is not a loud presence in the media. He does not seek out controversy or opinion. He is consistent in that way with the footballer he was. Present, considered, effective without being spectacular in any way that draws unnecessary attention. The players he was closest to throughout his career have spoken about his intelligence and his composure. Coaches who worked with him have described a player who was always thinking, always aware of the bigger picture. Eriksson at Lazio understood immediately what he had. Ferguson at United understood what he had, even if the environment made it difficult to express. The specificity of his quality is something worth staying with for a moment. Central midfielders at the highest level exist on a spectrum. At one end, there are players who are primarily destroyers, physical, aggressive, effective at disrupting opponents, less interested in and less gifted at constructing play. At the other end, there are players who are creative in a more traditional sense, quick, inventive, focused on the forward pass, on generating opportunities in the final third. Veron occupied a different position on that spectrum. He was a builder, a constructor, a player whose primary function was to give shape and direction to his team's possession, to be the point through which the game was organized. He did this through positioning. He was rarely in the wrong place, which meant the ball tended to find him when his team needed it to go somewhere constructive. He did it through awareness, the ability to scan the field continuously and accumulate information about where spaces were opening and closing, where opponents were concentrating their attention, where the next opportunity was likely to appear. And he did it through technical execution, the ability to take that information and act on it with passes that were accurate and well-timed and correctly weighted. There is a particular kind of difficult that experienced football people recognize in a player like this. It is the difficulty of playing without the ball in a way that makes the whole team better, of choosing positions that give teammates options, of understanding that your movement off the ball creates or closes space for others. These are things that rarely appear in statistics. They appear in the shape of a game, in the feeling of a team moving with purpose rather than scrambling, in the confidence of a goalkeeper who knows the ball will find a midfield player in a position to use it well. His father had been called the Witch, and the name carried across generations partly because of the mysterious quality that both of them seemed to possess, the ability to make the difficult look effortless. There is nothing mystical about it, of course. It is the product of intelligence, of experience, of thousands of hours of training and competition in which the understanding of the game is slowly deepened and refined. But it looks that way from the outside, when a player seems to step into the right position before the play has made that position obvious, when a pass arrives at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right location. The great midfielders of Veron's generation, and there were several, because the late 1990s and early 2000s was a period of exceptional central midfield talent in European football. Each had their own specific contribution. Zidane was the most complete, the most athletic, the most gifted in 1-versus-1 situations. Scholes was exceptional at arriving late into shooting positions and at distributing with precision in a way that complemented a direct English style. Pirlo came later and occupied a deeper role that suited his extraordinary ability to see the game from a stationary position. Veron was something adjacent to all of them, but not identical to any of them. He was a carrier of the game's structure, a player who made the team think more clearly about itself. The quietness of his later years is consistent with the career. He was never the one who demanded credit, who needed the spotlight. He competed at the highest level and accepted the judgments that came with that, including the ones that were incorrect, including the ones that misread him. He did not feel the need to litigate his time at Manchester United years later, or to insist that he had been misused or misunderstood. He simply moved on and continued to play football at a high level. The results continued to speak. What remains is a career that does not fit easily into a single narrative. It was not a story of uncomplicated triumph. It was not a story of talent wasted or ambition thwarted. It was a career shaped by the complexity of moving between different football cultures, by the challenge of applying a specific set of qualities in environments that did not always know how to use them, and by the clarity of knowing where you belonged well enough to eventually find your way back there. La Plata was always the answer. Estudiantes was always the center of gravity. The city laid out in its careful geometric grid, with its diagonal avenues cutting across the blocks, in ways that the original architects intended to create shortcuts, faster paths between destinations. That city formed a footballer who thought in angles, who saw the diagonals before others saw the straight lines, who understood that the most efficient route between 2 points is not always the obvious one. He played football with that understanding for more than 20 years. He played it in the heat of Buenos Aires and the tactical precision of Genoa and Parma and Rome. He played it in the noise and pace of Old Trafford and in the organized depth of San Siro. He played it in World Cups and continental finals, and in quiet league games in La Plata, in front of crowds that knew exactly who he was and what he represented. A midfielder who rarely needed to chase the game, because he so often understood where it was going. A presence that gave shape to the field around him, then carried that same understanding back to the place where it began. The tempo settles, the picture widens, and as the game grows quieter, the night follows. Good night.